All right, guys, it's time to go over the current playoff odds for the Green Bay Packers after that embarrassing loss last night versus the New York Giants, 24-20, bringing the Packers down below 500 yet again, now to 6-7. Entering the night last night, the Green Bay Packers playoff odds were at 71%, and I believe with a win would jump up to over 80%. But that wasn't the case. So in today's video, we're going to look at the current playoff odds because, yes, there still is a chance. Packers playoff odds aren't dead in the water yet. There is still a chance that the Packers make the playoffs a lot lower than it was before last night's game. But we're going to look at the current odds, what the odds would be if the Packers, say, win against the Buccaneers this week, which we'll see if that happens. Other games that we want to look out for, teams we want to root for, root against. So let's dive into it. If you do happen to be a new viewer here and want more Packers news analysis and updates every single day, such as game recaps, which I just put one out, click the link above to go watch that. I was actually at the game last night. Man, tough game. But if you want everything Packers, it's all here right on this channel. Go down and click subscribe. All right, so without further ado, let's bring up the screen. And as we see, the Packers are back down to a 50% chance at making the playoffs, a coin flip. This is what it was a few weeks ago. Then we got all the way up to 71%. Things were looking great. The Lions lost to the Bears. Yeah, sure, the Vikings won, but did they really in a 3-0 game? That was a disgusting game as well. But now we're back down to 50, right? We're back down to 50, and the remaining games, as we see here, Buccaneers this week in Lambeau, luckily. Then we're at Panthers, then at Vikings, then close out the year versus the Bears. So first, let's dive into the percentages just looking at these games. So if the Packers beat the Buccaneers this week, which at this point is a must win. Like if they lose against the Buccaneers, we're in big trouble at potentially making the playoffs. And at that point, if you lost back-to-back to the Giants and the Buccaneers, you probably shouldn't be in the playoffs. But if they beat the Buccaneers, then we're back up to 61%. But if you lose to the Buccaneers, the Packers are down to 27%. So at that point, this is a make or break game coming up. This is a big, big game coming up. So let's say the Packers beat the Buccaneers. Then they'd go on to beat the Panthers. Again, I've said this in previous videos. If you lose to the Panthers, you shouldn't be in the playoffs, right? That much is simple. You beat the Buccaneers, you beat the Panthers, we're back up above where we were last night. And that's with no other games happening. That's not with any other teams losing or anything of that sort, which will end up mattering at this point. Packers would be up to 75%. Then, week 17, head to Minnesota. Minnesota already beat them earlier this year. At this point, even though the Packers lost last night, I still think they're a better team than the Vikings. You know, it was a bad game, sure, but I still think overall they're a better team than the Vikings. If they beat the Vikings, then the Packers are pretty much in the playoffs. Now, of course, we have to look at if the Vikings also win multiple games. That has to do with it because as we see at the bottom here, the Packers would be 9-7, but the Vikings 7-7 because we haven't chosen their outcomes of their games yet. But if just this happens, right, which isn't the case, but if this just happens, right, and the Packers win 3, the chances of them making playoffs are very high. And of course, if they win 4, they're pretty much in the playoffs. So the Packers still basically control their own destiny. If they win out, they're pretty much going to make the playoffs. Now, if the Packers win out and the Vikings win every other game, then the Green Bay Packers that they play, because obviously they couldn't win out if the Packers win out as well because they play each other, and that would mean the Vikings beating the Bengals this week, the Vikings beating the Lions in week 16, losing to us in 17, then coming back and beating the Lions again in week 18, which I don't see them sweeping the Lions in 3 weeks twice. I just don't see that happening. The Packers would still be above them at 10-7. They'd have the tiebreaker. Vikings would be 7th seed. Packers would be 6th. The Packers would still be in the playoffs. So even if the Vikings, win 3 out of the next 4 and the Packers win 4 out of the next 4, including the win against the Vikings, the Packers still are in the playoffs. Now, you're probably wondering, what if the Packers lose to the Vikings but win the other 3 games? They still have a very high chance to make the playoffs if that happens. So the Packers could lose yet another game, another divisional game, and still have a high chance to make the playoffs. As you see here, and this is the Vikings winning out, which would actually put them at the division winner in the NFC North, which this isn't going to happen. But even if that all happens and the Packers win 3 out of the next 4 and lose to the Vikings and the Vikings win out, the Packers still have a very high chance to make the playoffs. But then it comes down to other teams like the Seahawks, and other teams such as that. All right, so now let's dive into the other games happening around the league week to week and who to root for and root against. But before we do that, I want to give a big shout out to today's video sponsor and this year's channel sponsor, BetUS. And with my link down in the description, you can actually get a 125% deposit match on BetUS up to $2,500. So if you deposit $100, then you'll have $225 to play with. And on BetUS, there are a ton of different NFL betting options, such as NFL props when you go into a specific game, as we see here, the Buccaneers Packers. There's also a ton of future bets as well. So you can bet on Coach of the Year. With last night's loss, highly doubt LaFleur is going to have a chance at Coach of the Year. That pretty much sunk that there. Defensive player, MVP, offensive, defensive, rookie, comeback player. And you can also bet on the Super Bowl winner. So if you go into the Super Bowl winner, we can look at the current Green Bay Packers odds at plus 12,500. So, if you were to place a $25 bet on the Packers winning the Super Bowl, you'd win $3,100, which I'm going to do right now. I'm going to place that bet because I'm a madman. Just place that bet, $25 to win $3,100 for the Packers to win the Super Bowl. So if you want to get in on all the action and check out all the cool things BetUS has to offer in terms of NFL betting and all other sports betting, go down, click the link, and get a 125% deposit match. All right, so now let's go into the other matchups. So we're going to start by giving the Packers the win this week against the Buccaneers, because like I said, that's pretty much a must win. Now, say the Packers did lose to the Buccaneers and still won the last 3 games. There still is a higher chance, than now that the Packers make the playoffs. So although it's a very bad thing if the Packers lose against the Buccaneers, it doesn't eliminate them. But if they lose against the Buccaneers and then win out, they still have an 84% chance. If they were to lose 2 games, they're pretty much out, right? Down to near a 10% chance at making the playoffs. Even if it was Bears and Buccaneers, it's still only like a 15% chance the Packers make the playoffs. So pretty much you can't lose 2 games. All right, so going at it as the Packers beating the Buccaneers in Week 15, they would be at 64% chance. Then when you're looking around the league at teams you want to lose, you'd have a slightly better odds if the Vikings lose. So you still want to root against the Vikings. So you want to root for the Bengals. At this point, you actually want to root against the Bears. They're actually only a game back behind the Packers. So technically speaking, the Bears could sneak into the playoffs, weirdly enough. I feel like the NFC is so odd. With the Giants last night, if they had lost, I believe they would have been like the 4th overall pick in the draft. But with the win, now they have a chance to potentially make the playoffs. They're like a game or 2 back behind wild card. So the NFC is very weird in terms of the bottom teams. So, the Bears still actually have a chance to make the playoffs here. So you want to root against the Vikings and Bears, and that's easy for us Packers fans, right? You also want to root against the Rams. That awesome overtime win, Ravens versus Rams, really helped the Green Bay Packers right now. So you want to root against them again. You want the Commanders to beat the Rams, and just like the last couple of videos, you also want to root against the Seahawks, and you want to root for the Eagles to beat the Seahawks, which that much should happen. Coming off of that loss against the Cowboys, the Eagles should go out there and handle business against the Seattle Seahawks. So, next week, Packers say beat the Buccaneers, say the Bengals beat the Vikings, the Browns beat the Bears, Commanders beat the Rams, Eagles beat the Seahawks, all probable things. Then the Packers are back up to where they were before last night, just slightly over that at 72%. Then going into Week 16, you would assume the Packers beat the Panthers. That would bring them up to 85% chance. And the same thing, you want to root against the Bears. So you want the Cardinals to beat the Bears. And you also want to root against the Giants because they are technically in, consideration for a wild card spot, like I said earlier, against the Green Bay Packers. So it's not going to change much, but, generally you want to root against the Giants as well because they're in consideration too. Say if that happens, the Packers beat the Panthers, the Cardinals beat the Bears, the Eagles beat the Giants. Again, all probable things. Then they're up to 90%. Then heading into Week 17, the Packers play Sunday night, so all the other matchups beforehand will happen. And at this point, if the Bears lost 2 games, you actually want to root against them to beat the Falcons. That would actually, heighten the Packers' odds. And at this point, you'd also root for the Rams. So it's kind of like it depends week by week basis. Any team that's around the Packers record, obviously root against. It changes because, if the Rams lose one week, but then are playing the Giants, you want the Rams to beat the Giants because then they're technically closer to the Green Bay Packers, so you'd want the Rams to beat the Giants here, the Bears to actually beat the Falcons, you'd want the Steelers to beat the Seahawks. So one thing that stays constant is you want the Seattle Seahawks to lose, but if all those three happen, the Packers are then at a 97% chance to make the playoffs even before Sunday night. So, if they win Sunday night against the Vikings, they're pretty much in the playoffs. And then as you see, if all that happens, which this is like a perfect scenario, going into week 18, no matter what happens, they're at a greater than 99% chance to make the playoffs. So, they wouldn't even need a win against the Bears there in week 18. If all that happens like I showed above, which 99% chance that all that doesn't happen exactly like that. So obviously things will change, but generally, the key things to note here are that the Packers can't lose 2 more games. There is a chance they could make it if they lose 2 more games, but at this point, that's not going to happen, in my opinion. The Packers need to win at least 3 out of the next 4 games. They cannot go 2-2. It's very important this week to get a win against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, although with a loss, it doesn't knock them out, but it's very important to get a win this week. So those are all the combinations. The Packers' current playoff odds heading into week 15 against the Buccaneers. This is going to be a big game coming up, huge for the Green Bay Packers and their potential at making the playoffs. Hopefully they can have a nice bounce back game against the Buccaneers this week after an awful performance last night against the Giants. Let me know if you like this sort of thing. If you did, please leave a like down below. I'll continue to do this every week so long the Green Bay Packers have a chance at making the playoffs. But I appreciate you guys coming by. I'll catch you on the next one. And as always, go Pack Go.